Yet we're still having to do basic things like get the milk and put out the cat. That's not just my words, that was a story shared from people in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and it reminds us of the strange parallel worlds we all exist in, one of seismic shifts and everyday life. My name is John Cooper, and it's my absolute privilege to be Director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As a movement of Christians challenged to bring alive a message of peace, we have many different elements to our story. An unexpected one has been to say COVID-19 is the second pandemic we've lived through, as we were formed in 1914, and so lived through the Spanish flu pandemic. Over the next few years, we at FOR will be exploring our history and heritage more. Therefore, it's my pleasure to welcome three speakers tonight who are going to lift all of our eyes wider and allow us to look more fully at the peace movement. We'll hear from each of them before a short period of breakout conversation, and then we'll come back to a large group conversation to listen and learn from each other. Our three speakers between them cover quite a wide range of interests. Toby Kelly is an academic based in Edinburgh who's just published a book looking at pacifist experiences of the Second World War. Verity Smith is a social historian and freelance museum curator who's helped, among other organisations, Trent Bridge Cricket Ground and Bradford Peace Museum. There's definitely a Venn diagram of history, action and cricket to be drawn, but that's for another week. Finally, we have Symon Hill, campaigns manager of the Peace Pledge Union. He's been quite thorough in producing books over many years about theology and different campaigns, but I think this year was his first history book, looking at the recent peace movement from the Falklands War onwards. Of course, it's not just the people who've written and published. There's everyone here as well, each with your own stories and your own contributions from your action for peace over many different years. So between us, we'll have a time of sharing, a time of learning, and hopefully a time of inspiration. Thank you very much to everyone for giving up some time this evening, and in particular to our three speakers who've prepared some comments to introduce us. So first of all, it's my privilege to turn to Toby. Good evening, Toby.
Thank you very much, John. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Great,
so
brilliant.
I'll hand over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to speak to you, but also to hear your responses, and I'm greatly looking forward to the discussion later. I should probably begin with an apology, which is the way of the world in this world of Zoom conversations. My children are downstairs, probably soon to come upstairs, so they may interrupt at any moment. They may conscientiously object to me being talking to you. So the first question John asked me to think about and speak about was what got me interested in peace as a particular topic of historical investigation. And I should probably begin by saying that I'm actually an anthropologist by training rather than an historian. So my interests are actually very anthropological in the sense that I'm very, fundamentally concerned with the attempt to make the familiar seem mundane and the mundane seem familiar. So to take the things we might take for granted and show how strange and wonderful they are, and all the things that we think are perhaps peculiar, and show how actually they make perfect sense within their own terms. My second confession is that I started out not actually interested in peace at all, but interested in conscience as a particular topic. Now, of course, not all conscientious objectors were pacifists, or if they were pacifists in often a very complex way. And the relationship between conscience and pacifism is inherently contingent, even if we often find them coming together. And it's also, I think, important to recognise that not all pacifists were conscientious objectors, because there were many other ways of protesting and witnessing that did not involve formal registration as a conscientious objector. But what got me first interested was actually serendipity, chance. I was doing some research in the National Archives in Kew, and I ordered up a folder, and I typed in the wrong number. And what I got by mistake was a folder of applications for exemption from military service on the grounds of conscience in the Second World War. These were all about half a page long, and on this half a page, people were asked to write and explain and manifest their deepest and most personal convictions and beliefs, to explain why they were genuine and sincere in half a page. And they were quite simply wonderful and fascinating and interesting and peculiar and frustrating. And they were much more diverse than you could ever possibly imagine, going far beyond the image or the stereotypical public image of what a conscientious objector in the First World War or the Second World War looked like. Yeah, they were Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, and there were Quakers, and there were Christian socialists, but there were anarchists, and there were Indian nationalists and Scottish nationalists, libertarians, the occasional fascist in there. And we can talk about that in an interesting way. But they came from a range of society as well. They were, as in the popular imagination, they were teachers and artists and civil servants, but they were also bricklayers and masons and fishermen and farmers and the unemployed. What there weren't, at least in this document, and I'll come back to this in a bit, is there were no women in this folder. There was a folder of about 300 applications, and there wasn't a single woman. And I think that's really, really important, and I'll come back to that later. But this got me kind of piqued and interested. Who were these people? Why did they do what they did? What did the world make of them? What did the anthropologist in me, more than anything, actually wanted to know what their friends and their neighbours and their boyfriends and their girlfriends and their scout leaders and their university teachers made of them, as much as what did the state or state officials make of them. Particularly because at that point I had all the images of what happened to conscientious objectors in the First World War, and particularly intrigued as well by the contrast between the First World War and the Second World War, and we can debate this on and on and on, but the general sense in the wider public is that the First World War was the tragic war, was a war of waste that needed to be avoided, and therefore, as far as the public are concerned, conscientious objectors, in hindsight, have a slightly heroic air to them. They were the people who could see through the tragedy and the waste of war. Whereas the Second World War, they hold a very, very different position. Partly because in the public imagination, this was, what people called the good war. So what does it mean to be a pacifist, to be against war, when the war is seen as being one of the few examples in the public imagination of a just war? So over the last 10 years or so, I've been trying to work out the answers to that. Who were these people? What did people make of them? Why did they do what they did? How did their convictions, their grand ideals actually relate to more prosaic concerns? What their mum thought of them, how they were going to earn a living. And I increasingly became aware that the relationship between these grand principles and what we might often think of as prosaic concerns was of fundamental importance. It's often said by historians that when people go to war, when people sign up to fight, they're not doing so for abstract ideas like nation or country or class. They are doing so because of friendships and kinship obligations. And I think that is equally the case for conscientious objectors. Their obligations and their sense of responsibility was always threaded through their obligations to their friends and family. So they may have been Christian socialists, they may have been Quakers, they may have been a combination, they may have been internationalists, but always intimate relations were really, really, really important. So perhaps it would be interesting to give you some examples of these people. So in the book I've just written, I follow 5 in detail, but I'll start with one in particular because she may be particularly interesting to the people here today, and because, to be honest, she's my favourite, and that's Stella St. John, who for much of the war was the membership secretary of the London branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. But on top of that, she was also many other things in a really interesting way. She came from a upper middle class family with a slight flavour of minor aristocracy somewhere in the distance. Family members in the not too distant past, kind of 1-2 generations ago, have been senior members in the military. She and her father was a doctor. She wanted to be a doctor too, and her parents forbid her from becoming a doctor. So she left home. She went to Dartington Hall in the southwest of England and worked in horticulture. Her parents then died when she was in her early 20s, and she inherited some money. Not enough money to train to be a doctor, but enough money to train to be a vet. So she moved to London, and after floating around various churches, she fell in with Donald Soper, and moved into the Central Methodist Hall and lived in a kind of a bunk room there. When war started, she was working as a vet. She was working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the morning in Red Lion Square. She was waking up early in the morning and serving tea and coffee to the people who emerged from the bomb shelters in the tube stations. She was volunteering in something called the Hungerford Club, which was a shelter set up and largely staffed by volunteers from the Fellowship of Reconciliation under Hungerford Bridge for the down and outs who were deemed too dirty and disease-ridden to go into the bomb shelters with everyone else. So Westminster Council looked around for people who would help and look after them, and they found Stella and her friends. And then on top of all of that, she also worked as an ambulance driver in the midst of the Blitz, ferrying the wounded backwards and forwards as a volunteer. When later on in the war, the British government introduced a kind of a form of industrial conscription for women, someone in the Ministry of Labour decided that wasn't enough, or that wasn't appropriate, and directed her to work for basically as a clerk in a tabulating company. Now, Stella was a convinced pacifist, remained a pacifist throughout her life. And was a remarkable character for her kind of quiet determination. She wasn't flashy in any way. She just got on to do it. And she just simply said, no, I'm not going to be directed in the way you want me. I'm not going to be compelled by the war machine, as she saw it. But I'm willing to do all these other things. I'm willing to work as a vet, work in a shelter, serve tea and coffee, work for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and work as an ambulance driver. The British state at the time decided that wasn't enough, so she went to prison. She was sent to Holloway Prison and spent a few months in Holloway Prison, and wrote very interestingly about it for the Howard League for Penal Reform. That's a very interesting pamphlet she wrote. why she's particularly interesting because women often found it very difficult to be recognized and acknowledged as conscientious objectors by the British state, but also to a certain extent by other British pacifists, although they have, of course, always played a central role in the history of the pacifist movement. So she's one that really stands out as someone in her own quiet, determined way, very shy, I get the sense, who was played a very significant role and serves as a kind of an example of a particular call to service in a very particular way. I'm aware of time. How much more time do I have, John? 2 minutes. So I've got other examples, but I won't talk about them. I mean, there are lots and lots of other interesting examples. Tom Burns, who volunteered with the Friends Ambulance Unit and was taken a prisoner of war. Ronald Duncan, who set up a pacifist farm on the Devon-Cornwall border. Roy Ridgway, again another volunteer for the Friends Ambulance Unit, who remained a pacifist throughout his life and was actually later on in the 80s involved in an anti-nuclear group that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and we might want to talk about the legacies of these people later. But the final thing, John, you asked me to say was a few sentences about why the period covered is one that the modern peace movement might want to think about and learn more from. It's an interesting and difficult question. I obviously think they are important, and I think we can learn lots from them. But I think we need to be careful in drawing those lessons, because I think, like many people in the mid and late 1930s, they organised their lives and their movements and their activism around an assumption that the Second World War would be like the First World War. So their techniques and their forms of opposition and their commitments were framed in the context of a different war. And it's often said that generals are often fighting the last war, and I think we might say something about the peace movement and being able to think forward rather than back, so not always looking back, I think is really important. But one of the really important things about them is when they were at their best and most dynamic, they were peace activists and they were other types of activists. So they were internationalists, or they were socialists, or they thought it was important to build agricultural communities, or they were humanitarians. And in many ways, that's when they were at the most dynamic, when they brought up coalitions with people who may not have been peace activists at the same time. And that's in many ways where their greatest legacy, I think, has been of this particular group. So you can't tell the history of British human rights or humanitarianism without looking at the history of these people, without looking at the history of Second World War conscientious objectors and Second World War pacifists. Their ethic, their conscience, if you like, is threaded through the history of human rights and humanitarianism. Amnesty International, one of the two key founders, was a conscientious objector, Eric Baker. And it's because of his conscientious objection that Amnesty adapted the idea of prisoners of conscience and required that they hadn't endorsed war and used the image of the flame. The first and even the second generation of people who worked overseas for Oxfam had largely also been conscientious objectors, had been ambulance workers for the Friends Ambulance Unit. And they had that expertise, and they had an ethical commitment, and they had a series of principles that was essential for the shape that Oxfam took in the next 20 years. But I'll stop there because I realise I've been wittering on, and we can come back to many of these things later. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. That was a great primer, and part of the reason we're going to have conversation and big and small later is to give us a chance to hear more of these stories. As you were talking, I was reminded there's a book which I was scouting about for I Can't See, a blue book published in about 1950 or something, which is one of the few books of statistics of conscientious objectors. And I actually emailed WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, about 3 weeks ago, because on one of the charts they put an asterisk and said the number of women was so small they were not worth recording. And so I emailed them and said, I want us to try and record that and to try and bring those stories alive next year. So thank you for already not just opening your eyes to who's in the room, but also who isn't. You've grounded us really well in some of the discoveries that can come from archives. And so it's really good to have with us a real specialist in how to help bring different spaces and times alive. I introduced her earlier, so I'll pass over to you, Verity. I'm really thrilled to have you and look forward to what you're about to share.
Thank you very much, John. I'm delighted to speak this evening. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm sorry if you can hear church bells in the background. I've just remembered it's bell ringing practice night and the parish church isn't far away. So apologies for that. Thanks very much, Toby, for your for starting us off this evening. That all sounds fascinating. So John has asked me to speak this evening a bit more about my work in museums, and really the first thing he asked me was what got me interested in museums and history and curating, and I had to give it a little bit of thought, and I don't think there is one particular moment, but thinking back, English and history were always subjects that I enjoyed at school. I had the opportunity to go on some interesting school trips, and certainly I was very fortunate that my parents took us on holiday and abroad, not just in this country as well, and visited some really interesting sites. And I suppose it also comes from the fact that my mum also studied ancient history, and I went on to university to study classical civilization. And I suppose while I was doing my A-levels, I was really thinking about what I could do with a degree in that subject. And I wasn't very keen on teaching, but wanted a way that I could work with that subject matter. Ironically, I haven't really worked with that subject matter for the last 13 years. Since I started out in museums, I did an archaeology internship at Leeds Museums and Galleries. Some of you may be familiar with some of their sites. So that really kind of put me on the path to a career in museums and galleries and curating, which I'm very fortunate to do a job that I really enjoy and is extremely varied. In terms of how we can make museums can make stories and objects come alive, I think John's phrase was what makes history come alive and break out of being objects in a glass case. And certainly I think history and museums are about people and they're for people. And really I've always been interested in people and stuff. So really a career marrying those two together is a pretty good combination. And certainly I've only come to the Peace Museum in the last few years. I was aware of it when I was starting out in museums. I've only worked with them directly in the last 2 years, all of which has actually been remotely and under lockdown, which has been a shame in some ways, but it's also been a privilege and a positive that we've also been able to meet with lots of different people via the medium of Zoom, and there'd be a little bit more flexibility around the work that I've done with them. In terms of, I don't know the collection all that well at the Peace Museum, but so that, and some of you will be very familiar with the Peace Museum, and for others you won't be. But it was started in the early 90s and up until a couple of years ago was open in a tiny space up a flight of stairs, not accessible by lift, in the very centre of Bradford city centre, really hidden away, and had that classic case of local people don't know it was there, have gone past it, never been in, haven't ever engaged with it. And certainly I'm pleased to say that actually during this year they'll be moving to a new site that is much more accessible, and it's bigger. They've outgrown the current place in terms of their collection and their exhibition space and so on. And really, the Peace Museum is well connected internationally, but I don't know that it has the same recognition in this country. So I hope things like this will give it a little bit more publicity and so on. And certainly I've talked about it with friends and colleagues while I've been working with them in the last couple of years. In terms of the objects and things that I know about their collection, there are certainly a lot of items telling kind of national stories. They've got a lot of banners from things like CND and Green and Comment and various protests. But actually the things that kind of stand out to me, and this is generally in museums and when I'm working on projects in all kinds of different subject areas, there are some very personal items as well, such as a suitcase from a man who came on kinder transport to the UK as a young child. And really it's those kinds of objects that are very ordinary and are very everyday, and we probably all have them and we associate them with much more positive times. But actually that suitcase symbolized somebody's entire life in a small box, effectively, not knowing what was coming next, not knowing whether they would see their family again, and not knowing what a country that was unknown to them would hold. So that objects like that represent a lot of things, and actually once you get to know the story behind such mundane objects, that's really the thing that makes them come alive, and that's the thing that I always connect with. And I think museums are able to connect people to their collections through those stories, and for people to see something of the familiar and the identifiable and the ordinary in such extraordinary times. And I think that's particularly pertinent this week. This week is Refugee Week. Yesterday was actually World Refugee Day. And certainly in Leeds and Bradford, I was pleased to see Little Amal, the artist, refugee, this huge puppet, come to the centres of Leeds and Bradford yesterday and highlight current things, as we all know, in terms of situation in Ukraine, but actually that particularly in this area where in Bradford, where the Peace Museum is, it's a melting pot of the world, and it is always accepted people from all over the world, from all kinds of situations and cultures, and continues to do so. And I think that has a huge place in the Peace Museum, and I think the Peace Museum is actually keen to not only look to the past and tell those stories of World War and conscientious objection and protests from the last 30, 40, 50 years, but actually what's happening in the here and now, and how we respond to that, and how we can affect what happens next. I think I hugely value working in the Peace Museum on the simple level of just a lovely team of people and interesting people to work with. And in terms of the work that I did with them, that was really about their organisation becoming more diverse and equal and open to opportunity and engaging with all kinds of groups of people that they perhaps hadn't encountered before. And that's an ongoing process. That doesn't happen overnight, but certainly I know they've made huge progress just in the last couple of years since I've worked with them. And I know they've got big plans as they physically move their museum to a new site, which I'm not sure is public knowledge yet, so I won't say any more about that specifically. But I think in terms of value for myself, it certainly has opened my eyes to people's experiences, the kinds of people living in the local area, how people interpret peace, what peace means to them, and their own experiences of the opposite of what we would consider peaceful. And actually it's really interesting working with the Peace Museum in the last couple of years, and that actually came after a long contract that I did as a curator at the National Civil War centre. So really that's, which for those of you who don't know, the Civil War Centre is in Newark and actually tells the story of the British Civil Wars. So 17th century, several hundred years ago. But actually, I have another couple of projects in the pipeline with them that it is working to make the subject matter there actually relevant to people today. And it is that kind of answering that question of, oh, why should I care about something that happened 300 or 400 years ago? So I thought it was really interesting coming from that into working with Peace Museum, and certainly I'm starting to get to know other organisations such as the Curator Tapestry Museum, and there are future collaborations in the pipeline, and that's really exciting because I think they all have a role to play in what we consider as peace, and they're all part, I suppose, of the modern peace movement in their own way. So definitely it's opened my eyes to that, and I've certainly learned a huge amount about my own country's history in the context of peace, which has been really fascinating. So I'm going to stop there and let Symon speak next.
Thank you so much, Verity. That was a brilliant overview, and you're right to just remind us of the power of everyday objects. It's not a peace-related thing, but one of my teachers at secondary school ended up becoming one of the first Green Party MSPs in Scotland when the new Scottish Parliament started, and he'd made this giant polyester 2 that he took everywhere to say second vote Green, and it was really odd during the elections. He would pop up with something that he'd made for sort of, you know, £10 and a spray can in the back office, but then because suddenly he was successful, it's ended up in the collection of the National Museum of Scotland. And just like what was said about just grabbing that suitcase and heading out, it really is those small things that bring a bigger story to life.
Yeah.
So thank you for drawing our attention to that. So now, as Verity so kindly introduced, we're going to think about a more modern period of history, which is probably longer ago than some of us would like to think, which is, of course, from the Falklands War onwards. And Symon spent a long time in many different archives, including visiting Peace House and our non-violence library and our back catalogue of FOR publications to read through what was current then, and for him is now history. So Symon, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you all very much for coming along, and to John and FOR for inviting me here. It's been great to listen to Toby and Verity, and just picking up on those points that Verity made about the nature of history. History is about the present. History is about how we interpret the past for the sake of the present and the future. As Verity said, it's about people, and it's for people now. I was struck a couple of years ago when people in Bristol took non-violent direct action to pull down the statue of Edward Colston, and there were people in the right-wing media saying, oh, they're destroying history. No, they were doing history. They were interpreting the past. They were commenting on the past for the sake of the present. They were interpreting the past and choosing what to do about it. They were literally doing history. That's what history is. And I'm pleased that, you know, one of the jobs I have is teaching history for the Workers' Educational Association. The other job, as John mentioned, is working part-time for the Peace Pledge Union. I've been interested, the Peace Pledge Union. I've been interested in history since I was a very small child, and growing up in a working class family in the 80s, I became rather passionate about inequality and about injustice and violence, and I was keen to see how stories from the past actually raised questions about how change happens and why it happens and who brings it about. And I became a pacifist when I was 17, and after that my pacifism was informed and perhaps became more mature and nuanced, and was also informed by my Christian faith as I came to believe there was a power greater than the power of violence. But also, one of the things that matters to me about pacifism is that whereas militarism is about doing what you're told, pacifism is about not doing what you're told. The conscientious objectors who Toby referred to, as he said, they came from a wide variety of different perspectives, different motivations, weren't always, some had more worked out and detailed understandings of peace than others. But they were all, in a sense, not doing what they were told. I think it's a shame that the word peace has come to mean, been misused to mean order and conformity, as in the wonderfully contradictory expression breach of the peace, which means if you go and campaign for peace, I've been arrested for breach of the peace at the London Arms Fair, whereas actually I was trying to preserve peace. It was the Arms Fair that was breaching the peace. And I came across this so much when I was researching the book, with so many people objecting to or laughing at the whole notion of breach of the peace when it meant breach of the established way of doing things. Now, this book covers a period of time that is familiar, or parts of it will be familiar to everyone here. And all of it will be familiar to some people here, because it's the last 40 years, just before the Falklands War, so 1980 to 2021. The last incident, the most recent incident in the book, happened a week before I submitted the final manuscript to my publisher. So very, very up to date. And I'm 45, so that's all within my own lifetime. And yet, obviously, in 1980, I was 3. And despite some people's perceptions of me, even I wasn't involved in peace activism at the age of 3. So there are parts of the book that are the last few years, the last 20 years, 25 years, when I've been very involved in peace activism and I can relate to. There's parts of the book covered a period a bit earlier when I was a teenager, where I was aware of what was going on in the news, but perhaps not involved myself. But the early parts of the book happened when I was a child. The Falklands War began a week after my 5th birthday. And obviously, for those of you who are a bit older than me, you'll have a much greater memory of the Falklands War. Whereas as I got a bit older, understood the Falklands War as something that had just happened and grew up in the shadow of it, really. So I'm very conscious that there are some things I'm writing about that are not things I can remember, but nor are they things that none of us can remember. If I was writing about the English Civil Wars, for example, they'd be things none of us know about. But I might find myself talking to people about things that they can remember and I can't. I'm very, very conscious of that. And I hope I've borne faithful witness to those people who I interviewed and those records that I drew on. Because as I researched peace activism in the 1980s, it became clear to me that already we're rewriting a lot of it, or perhaps already we're forgetting some of it. So I grew up with the impression that the Falklands War was supported by almost everybody, that there was very little protest, that it was almost universally accepted. And okay, that's the impression we're often given of wars, but the Falklands War especially, to the point where a lot of peace activists I know who are a bit older than me, who were involved in that campaign, talk about how lonely they were, how beleaguered they felt. It was only recently that I discovered that even after the end of the Falklands War, the opinion polls were showing about 20% of the population, still the UK population, still thought it had been wrong to fight it. Perhaps a lot of them were keeping their heads down because of the gung-ho atmosphere. And that's why a lot of the pacifists at the time did feel that they were in a lonely minority, and interviewing some of them for the book was fascinating for that reason. Very, very little has been written on the history of opposition to the Falklands War. Obviously, there's books arguing against the Falklands War, which were written at the time and so on. But in terms of, as a historian writing about that opposition, there's very little to find out. I had to dig through a lot of archives, which during lockdown was, or even during the post-lockdown period, was very difficult. And John's one of the people who I thank in the book for letting me into the FOR archives, where we had to stand 2 meters apart with masks on and try not to cough on each other. And I had to start piecing together different bits about the Falklands War. There was a demo in Edinburgh on this day, and there was a direct action in Sheffield on that day, and people in Wales were doing were fasting for peace on such and such a day, and it was bitty. But there were protests at some point in many of the towns and cities in the UK against the Falklands War. There were at least 118 arrests of people protesting against it. Relatively small number compared to some other wars, but actually we don't have that picture of there being any protests from the way it's talked about. There's now a bit more on Wikipedia about Falklands War protests than there used to be, and and that's partly because I've written it, because I became frustrated with the lack of it, so I was adding things as I was researching. At the victory parade against the Falklands War, the victory parade celebrating the Falklands War in October 1982, there were a number of arrests, including of 10 people who tried to block the road of the parade, one of whom was knocked unconscious as they were thrown into the back of the van. I notice somebody's written in the chat about Runce's sermon in St. Paul's, which refused to glorify the war, and that's still talked about, of course. Something else I discovered about the 1980s was how quickly peace groups, as well as other organisations, can be guilty of trying to claim credit for things that they didn't do. If you read about CND now, particularly things written perhaps officially by CND, you might get the impression that the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp was some sort of CND initiative. Actually, at the time, CND was very divided over whether to support it. And there were much stronger divisions than we may acknowledge once something's become accepted. And actually better known organisations get the credit for things that smaller groups did, and so on. And that particularly in brief articles or passing references in books about other things, typically bigger peace groups are given the credit for things that smaller groups did, CND and Greenham being a common example, but there are others. Something I found fascinating also was the things that can be found in government documents that have been released under the 30 years rule, as it used to be. It's no longer always 30 years, but have been released. And one of my favourite, one of the funniest and perhaps most encouraging, relates to Easter 1983, when there were to be big demos at Greenham and CND. CND and Greenham managed to work together for once, and there were demos at Greenham and at Aldermaston against nuclear weapons. There was a human chain formed between Greenham and Aldermaston. Demos in Scotland as well, in Glasgow, the same weekend. And documents that came to light only a few years ago reveal how much in the corridors of power the government was talking about trying to distract the media's attention from these protests, which suggests they took the peace movement rather more seriously than they gave the impression sometimes. And Bernard Ingham, who was Thatcher's press officer, suggested trying to get the media to focus on the new royal baby, Prince William, who was on his first trip to Australia and New Zealand, and to make sure there were plenty of pictures of him available that very weekend. He also suggested, sounding rather more desperate, that the media could be encouraged to focus on traditional bank holiday activities, such as ferret racing and tortoise racing and whippet racing. I don't know. You know, I mean, I was a child in the 1980s and I never raced any tortoises, but perhaps some people did. But, you know, at the end of the weekend, actually, you know, and Michael Heseltine as Defence Secretary went to Germany to visit British troops, but then in West Germany, he got asked about the protests in Britain. The nuclear protests did get lots of coverage. There were photos of the baby William in Australia, but the nuclear protests did get a lot of coverage, and from what I can find out, the coverage of tortoise racing was extremely limited. I just want to say, I know I'm aware of the time, but I just want to say something about Iraq, because one of the things that people will ask about when we talk about the peace movement and its successes and failures is Iraq. In 2003, we had a situation where the majority of the UK population did not support a war, and Britain should not have gone to war without the support of the majority of the population. That shouldn't have been possible. And we as the peace movement failed to stop it. Now, I do think we achieved a lot, but I do think the peace movement that built over the Iraq war had a longer term impact. And if we look at the parliamentary debates on the bombing of Syria in 2013, when Parliament voted not to bomb Syria, the long shadow of Iraq can be seen in the questions that people were raising. I also think it had an impact in various other ways. But one of the problems is that we now talk about the protests against Iraq in the light of the 1 million person march. And that was a great march, but it was a march. And after that, the peace movement split effectively, with the Stop the War Coalition just repeating endless marches through central London, which predictably got smaller each time, and others trying to take direct action, which the Stop the War Coalition largely didn't support. I'm not saying all its members or even all its leaders, but largely didn't support. There was an attempt by 5,000 people to enter the RAF base in Fairford in Gloucestershire, which is one of the biggest protests at a military base since the 80s. We've forgotten about the direct action over Iraq. And one of the things I think we can ask ourselves is, if there'd been more of a focus on direct action, could we have stopped the war, or rather stopped Britain's involvement in it? I ask that as a question if I'm not giving an answer to it. But I would like to leave you with a quote, not from me, but from somebody whose name is unknown, but who I think I occasionally think of her and find her quite encouraging. The story is told by Garda Rizuki, who was the office manager for the Stop the War Coalition. And in the run-up to the Iraq War, Garda described a phone call received at the office. So I'll read that. I'll read Garda's quote, herself quoting the woman calling. A woman called up and said, "I can't come on the demo because I'm very old and not very mobile." So I said, "That's okay. What if I send you a few flyers that you can have in your home? And if someone comes round, you can give it to them." And she said, "No, no, my dear, you don't understand. I'm going to go and lie down on the M3. Thank you.